It's not a race. I call the Honourable Member Jacinda Ardern.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a gamble every time, but I appreciate your opportunity. And I know, Mr. Prasad, that only gives him more time, Dr. Prasad, what an outrage of me, to prepare further queries for the Minister and the Chair, and I certainly have some of my own. I think just though for the purposes of those who may be watching this crucial debate and may be seeking a summary perhaps of what we're debating here in Part 3. Obviously, my colleague, the Honourable David Cunliffe, has already talked about the ability for the government to set whole-of-government directions. There's some debate around whether or not that is indeed possible. He set that out. I'll have a little bit more of a discussion about that. But other elements of this part include requiring the boards of statutory Crown entities to ensure that the entities collaborate with other public entities where practicable. I wonder whether or not the Minister and the Chair could talk us through some examples perhaps that may have been canvassed at Select Committee level of what that may look like, situations where that may have been something that we could have benefited from previously, but without having that set out clearly in this in the Crown Entities Act, which is what that amendment amends, weren't able to do that. That I think would be beneficial to the House if we had some tangible examples there to work from. Equally, Part 3 enables the broadening of the grounds on which the Minister of Finance and the Minister of State Services, as I've already said, can issue whole-of-government direction, and allowing directions to be issued to smaller groups of entities. I do have some questions at that point, Mr. Chair, around the degree to which that then hands over the discretion or the power of the primary minister who oversees a particular department by broadening the role of the Minister of Finance. For instance, in clause 162 amends section 107, and that is the whole of government directions, which of course have been changed to directions to support the whole of government approach, and it sets out there that the Minister of State Services and the Minister of Finance may jointly direct Crown entities to support a whole of government approach by complying with specified requirements for any of the following purposes. Firstly, to improve directly or indirectly public services. B, to secure economies or efficiencies. C, to develop expertise and capability. D, to ensure business continuity. And E, to manage risks to the government's financial position. And there's quite a broad range of, a broad set of, criteria which would allow that specific intervention. And Mr. Chair, I raise this because I've seen, particularly in recent times with the management of the Ministry of Social Development, where recently the Minister undertook a process where a company by the name of Taylor and Fry carried out an actuarial valuation of the future liability of welfare, essentially, in New Zealand, put a figure on it, and the consequence of that, or the reason that the government claimed that it wanted to do this, was to put requirements, set directions for the Ministry of Social Development by Treasury as to what they then had to achieve to bring that future liability down. And that potentially the Ministry of Social Development could lose future funding, baseline funding, almost putting them on a whole of government performance pay, that whole ministry could lose future funding if it did not reduce its future liability. Now, you can raise significant questions over that. As soon as you hit financial trouble or you hit a recession and you have an increase in number of people placing demands on the welfare state, and then suddenly you have a department unable to meet their requirements as set out by Treasury, their baseline drops, their ability to then do their work and reduce their future liability, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, if you will, Mr. Chair. But my concern is that all of this actually has been governed, has been driven by the Minister of State Services and the Minister of Finance. In fact, Mr Chair.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr Chair. In fact, in Cabinet papers on this particular issue that I've read, they've all been signed off by the Minister of State Services and the Minister of Finance. They are the ones driving an agenda within the Ministry of Social Development to the degree to which now that their departments have significant oversight, significant power, which has always existed, but this is much more explicit now over the operations of the Ministry of Social Development, to the degree that it almost feels like the Chief Executive is secondary in their own department to the Secretary of Treasury. That is almost how the hierarchy now seems within the Ministry of Social Development. Now, I have concerns about that in and of itself. Now, that has already happened. Now, with these directions to support the whole of government approach, I guess my concern is to what degree are our own ministries able to manage internally their own statement of intent, and to what extent is this actually now being overseen by the State Services, the Minister of State Services and the Minister of Finance. And as I say, Mr Chair, it's already happening to a degree now, so it's hard to know necessarily whether or not this changes that much or actually just sets out the legislative framework for that. I did want to also point out, Mr Chair, that we do have some changes to the statement of intent. It looks like there was some select committee debate around the issuing of statements of intent. Obviously, a statement of intent sets out not just the priorities for a government department, but how it will get there. And in the summary of the Select Committee discussion on the changes to the issuing of statements of intent, there have been changes, it appears, to ensure that there is transparency if there's ever a recommendation by a minister to extend the amount of time available to issue a statement of intent, or indeed issue a waiver for an issuing of a statement of intent. And I do applaud the attempts to ensure that there's transparency when those decisions are made. And I'll just cover off where that's covered in the Act. It states in 139A, a minister may grant an extension of time for or waive a requirement to provide the statement of intent if a Crown entity is likely to have a significant change in the nature or scope of its functions, and the responsible minister may grant the Crown entity an extension of up to 1 year of the period specified. I thought it would be useful for the House to hear perhaps the process that was undertaken for MOBI. We don't call it that anymore. What do we meant to call it now? MB. The new MOBI, the new giant entity. What process they went through for this, for their reissuing of a statement of intent. I think it would be useful to know how they managed that process, what kind of time period was required, because that was a significant change, and I would assume that there wouldn't be much beyond that scale. And so if they were able to complete that within a specified time frame, is a year perhaps too generous a time frame to be issued? I'd be interested in the Minister and the Chair's view on that. But it also states that the responsible minister must not grant an extension unless he or she is satisfied that the extension will enable the entity to improve the quality of the statement of intent that it provides. Now, that seems to me to be quite a broad provision, because surely any minister could create a justification that just looking at a statement of intent, they need extra time because I think it can be better than this. You don't really need much beyond just the opinion of the minister to decide under that quite broad set of criteria. But I am satisfied that because even though that is broad, that there is a transparency around when they are making that decision, that it must be published. And I think probably the balance there is about right. My question, though, is if it does seem clear that there is some kind of stalling tactic at play around a statement of intent, what right of redress to keep in check the use of the minister's power and discretion in that regard is appropriate? Now, it's a genuine question. It may well indeed be contained in the legislation that, for instance, an appeal could be made to the State Services Commission or the Minister of State Services to check that the discretion had been used appropriately around that extension of time. But is that indeed intended to be the way that you would seek redress if an extension or a waiver was granted and there was concern that that power had not been used appropriately, how is that then? How is that redress sought? Particularly when one assumes that to improve the quality of the statement of intent, one would be able to access a draft, Mr. Chair.
I call the Honourable Member Rajin Prasad.
There you go. Thank you very much. You can't